Okay, everybody, we're gonna go ahead and get started. So we'll call this meeting to order. If you haven't already, there's a sign-in sheet out in the hallway. You can do that on your way out. So first we need to approve the minutes from October 16th, 2025. Second, all those in favor? Aye. All right, those have been approved. So today's topic is site plans. Just a reminder, this is, we're gonna have a little presentation from staff. Then we'll do some discussion, answer any questions you might have. If you have any feedback, suggestions, examples from other communities that you think works well and you want to share, we'll just, chat about what we heard. And then our goal with all of these is kind of at the end, we'll do sort of a big report. And then hopefully if we've heard some things that make sense for us to apply to our process, then we will. And then the council will vote on any changes. We do have a big code review update coming, so some things may happen in the near future and some things we might have to kind of wait on that bigger update coming here in the future. So just for your kind of knowledge, and just a reminder, to be respectful and, everybody works hard. So just try to understand where people are coming from and be a good listener. And then at the very end, after the discussion, we do have some follow-ups from the construction plan, SWIP and final plat. So information, if there were questions asked, that kind of thing. And then we'll adjourn. And with that, I'm going to hand it over to Chris Seavey.
Good morning, everyone. I'm happy to be here presenting our process as it relates to site plan applications. This is our fourth meeting in a series of meetings regarding why and how we do what we do. There are some complications to the process for site plan review that staff does their best to manage, and we'll get into that today. So here's an overview of what we'll be covering. There are 3 levels of review: land use, administrative, and then P&Z and council review. We'll cover the application requirements and then some review criteria worth considering as you may be putting a site plan application together. And lastly, I'll talk about the review process, including the steps and the timeline for approval. Okay, so up on the screen, you'll see 3 different review types ranging from least complex on the left to most complex on the right. A simple way to look at this is the land use permits. The simplest are for projects that are simple enough for one staff person to review and sign off. Now that staff person may briefly confer with others in the city depending on unique circumstances, but land use permits by and large can be issued within a very short time frame by that staff person. These are projects such as fences, sheds, detached garages, driveways, and most single-family residences, other small projects like that. Administrative review means we need several departments of the city to sign off and be on the same page. This includes building department, engineering department, Cedar Falls utilities, planning, public works, and others as the case may be. There are often considerations that all of those departments need to reach consensus on. And these are for projects that are larger than single family in our typical districts. By typical, I mean R1, R2, R3, C1, C2, C3, M1, M2. And then a couple of other districts. We have a planned manufacturing district or MP. And we have our downtown character district. And then RP, planned residence district, also can fall into this category. Now, a small caveat there is that RP and MP, since they're planned districts, there's a master plan typically associated with those. Those can be sometimes if there's a project that would include a master plan amendment that would have to go through P&Z council. P&Z council review has some extra steps where the approval ultimately comes quasi-judicially or by the vote of those deciding bodies. They ultimately decide, especially where the review criteria are subjective by nature rather than objective. Something that just takes the judgment of a person or a body that regard. We'll talk about that a little bit. In the next few slides. Now let's touch on what goes into a site plan application. To be considered a complete submittal, we need a completed application with all fields filled out. Then there is a fee typically paid by check. $250 for administrative review, or $350 if it involves P&Z accounts for review. Not much else to say about that. We need a complete detailed description of the proposed work that's proposed to be done. To give you an idea what that is for, we often insert that description into our staff reports so as to not misrepresent exactly what an applicant is proposing to do. Of course, the most important piece is the actual site plan itself. This typically should be put together by a licensed engineer. And there is a 1.5 page checklist for all things that need to be shown on the site plan. So that's something to keep in mind. Some of those checklist items, and also the ones for the, as far as the application documents to include, may not apply to a project. And we'll talk briefly about pre-application meetings. You probably talked about them before. But that's a good place to determine whether something should be included on a site plan or in a site plan application. So if it doesn't apply, you can put NA on that site plan application. As for other items here, things that may or may not be applicable, stormwater management plan, floodplain elevation certificate, things that need to be produced by an engineer, traffic impact study as well. Description of current and proposed easements, including legal descriptions, notation of planned project modifications, variances, or minor adjustments granted or proposed, and a copy of the deed of dedication or restrictive covenants, if any, of the applicable subdivision. And then a legal description of the property in Word. That's typically used for official documents. A resolution typically needs a legal description. You want to make sure that any decision that's made on the property you're trying to propose a project for, that is legally referenced the correct way in city's documents. So we rely fairly well on that. We do double check that, but I would double check yourself. Just it's advisable. So up on the screen are some common omissions that we often see missing, like a vicinity map, a lighting plan, a landscape plan. And even where we have a landscape plan, there are often details that are missing, such as, the actual species that are proposed, the quantity, the height of maturity. And those are important details that we use in our review. There are some aspects of the code that require, an overstory tree versus an understory tree. So it's just, those are important details to include. Also, architectural building elevations showing dimension and materials and signage plan. And a few of the best practices I'll note here for site plans. Some of the best site plans we've received have these on there. They do a lot of the review work in some respects for us. And it's a way for you as the applicant to demonstrate that you've met the criteria that's in the code. So these are things like clearly calculating or stating all requirements, like planning points, the number of parking spaces, the percent green space, the percent impervious, the setbacks, the building height, things like that. And then with that, calculate and state clearly what is provided or proposed to meet those requirements. So as that's listed on the site plan documents, it really is the best practice for us to be able to review at a glance. It really reduces the amount of review time and helps us to help you, so to speak, when it comes to the time to these things. Label everything clearly and demonstrate compliance. This includes all the setbacks and dimensions of things, whether it's the dimensions of parking spaces or parking aisles or the distance from the lot lines of a building, any of that kind of stuff. And then just, if there's any question, don't hesitate to contact one of the planners of the city or the one that's over your project. You've been communicating with. So, now, up on the screen are the primary criteria for evaluation of a site plan. These are helpful to consider as you're putting the site plan together. So questions like, is the site plan in compliance with the technical requirements of zoning, engineering, building, and fire code? Now, you're probably not going to know everything as far as all of those codes are concerned. That's why we have a technical review committee. But it is helpful to familiarize yourself, at least with the zoning requirements. It's kind of the starting point. And then also compliance with the master plan or design guidelines and development procedures agreement, if it's in an MU or an RP, or like a planned district of some sort. And then does the proposal meet the architectural standards if there are any? Up on the screen are some use considerations that are part of site plan review. Things like, what is the vehicular circulation in relation to streets and access points? How does the site interact with other sites and land use nearby? The adverse impacts or scenarios that negatively affect the neighborhood. What are the peak hours and anticipated activity? What mitigating measures can be undertaken? As you consider these things, it really tends to make for a better product and a better project again. Now, how are pedestrians and cyclists served by the site? Now, it's quite often that we don't see, paths to that connect, the pedestrian infrastructure to the site, where there's only vehicular access. So it's just a thing to take in mind. Is the applicant proposing to build sidewalks as required? So if sidewalks are not built in adjacent to the site, typically that is required. How is the applicant accounting for utilities, underground and overground? And also easements related to those utilities or even access easements. So, and then up on the screen are some design considerations for buildings. Buildings specifically, I should say. These questions contain actual language from the code worth considering as you're designing a building. Several sections of our code call for the consideration of proportion, roof shape, pitch, direction, fenestration, so windows, material, including quality and durability, the texture, the color, and architecture. Consider how the building and use fits into the neighborhood. So some questions. These are direct from the code as well. Is the architecture compatible with the design elements found on adjoining properties? Does the building complement and reinforce the pedestrian environment? Are the proposed materials comparable and similar to other buildings in the neighborhood? Is the scale and character comparable to that of adjoining properties? Are there any potential nuisance issues that could arise from proposed building and proposed building and use? So here's a timeline. The typical review time for a site plan application can take as much as 2 to 3 months for administrative review, which is represented by the left side of this graphic. We have 2 technical review committee meetings per month, practically speaking, getting comments from one technical review and then having those fully addressed in time for publishing in the next tech review agenda. Not usually feasible, but not unheard of, but like I said, not usually feasible. It is our general experience that this process takes a couple months to iron out a good plan through the administrative review process. But just as a matter of expectation, there's enough complication in a technical review with all the code areas considered that even the best site plans will have comments to address or consider, even if it's a shorter list. And then P&Z and council review, if applicable, adds about 2 months to the process. Their review is primarily for criteria in the code that is subjective in nature, where someone has to decide whether something looks good or fits in, which judgment can vary from one opinion to another. It should be noted that under council's direction, we are actively in the process of changing areas of the code to have primarily objective criteria. This is what has been done with our downtown code. So since that code was updated in 2021, projects have been able to get approved in downtown without the extra timeline of P&Z and council approval. So hopefully at this time next year, we'll have a similar process for College Hill, which currently goes to P&Z for what seems like every little improvement that someone wants to do to their property. So we will come back to this slide later in the presentation in case you have questions or would like to discuss. As a matter of process, we welcome and even recommend pre-application meetings. I'm only touching on this since it has been covered in our previous presentations. I'll just note that we really only can offer one, maybe two pre-application meetings at most, just because staff can only provide so much insight with only so much information, or rather so little information. And again, not everyone is in the room for those meetings, so tech review is really where the meaningful insight is going to come. So one of the pivotal questions that we ask once an application is received is if the application itself is complete. So that's really the first step. If it is incomplete, then the applicant is often made aware very quickly of the same, and then the applicant has to then submit at the next application deadline. And the application deadlines are outlined in the application itself. So incomplete applications do not get scheduled for a tech review meeting agenda. So that can delay the review process by 2 to 3 weeks if an incomplete application is submitted. And then, things we've talked about before, these review criteria, these are the questions that are typically asked or discussed in a tech review. A technical review committee takes place on a Wednesday, and just so you're aware, the staff expectation is to compile and send tech review comments by Friday of the same week. Now that could be delayed depending on how complex the project is. Typically not though, but if it is, staff will reach out and let the applicant know that we'll have the comments as soon as possible on the following Monday or Tuesday. So. And here are some common tech review discussion points. This is an opportunity for staff to reconcile where codes overlap with each other. The questions like, aspects of the site plan, landscaping within the right of way or easements. Potential conflicts with utilities, depending on what's being proposed and where. The location and screening of dumpsters, refuse containers. The type, durability, and quality of proposed materials, parking areas and stormwater management issues, fire safety standards such as hydrant locations, fire sprinkler requirements, proper access to distant areas of the site, fire engine access, and turnaround capability. And then also ADA accessibility issues. I believe you've seen this slide before with the other presentations. These steps are important to understand what staff is doing in preparation for P&Z and council. Talking about sending out notice to neighbors within 200 feet of the subject property. Staff prepares reports and exhibits for the P&Z agenda packet. Also the presentation for the P&Z meeting to put together. This is in addition to the staff report that the staff puts together. P&Z meets the second and fourth Wednesdays, and the agenda packet is published the Friday prior to the meeting. The P&Z typically holds 2 meetings for a site plan review. First meeting is really for introduction and discussion, and if there's anything to be addressed, you know, there's that opportunity to have that addressed by the second meeting when the planning and zoning commission would make a recommendation, and then staff would prepare that case to go to council. And then it's typically only one meeting at city council unless the agenda item is pulled for discussion and there's a desire for a continuation of that discussion at a future council meeting. And council only discusses the proposal if it is pulled for discussion. It is very, very possible for it to be just approved with a blanket approval on the resolution calendar, which is just how council operates. And then just an important note here, the site plan is valid for 1 year from the date of approval. That expiration, so to speak, would only take effect if work has not begun. If that makes sense. There is an opportunity for the applicant to ask staff for to request an extension. Typically, staff can grant a year, another year for that. And then that really is all I had. I have the timeline back up on the screen.
Thanks, Chris. Does anyone have any questions for clarification?
Can you explain what that whole process you were talking about and what that applies to? Is that development, commercial, home building, or is it all inclusive?
So everything that is a larger project than a single family house, typically these processes apply to that. Now, whether it goes through P&Z council review is really dependent on the zoning district that it's in. So typically, if it's in one of our specialized districts, or right now, if it's in the College Hill neighborhood overlay, most projects in those districts have to go through P&Z council review. Everything else can go through this kind of staff administrative technical review. This left side of the screen here is what most other projects go through.
Chris, you had that slide that showed which zones go through.
Yeah.
Administrative review versus council review.
So you can see what districts we're talking about. A1, R1, R2, R3, R4, and then downtown, MP, and RP.
Now, one thing I'd say about RP is depending on the developmental procedures agreement. So because RP often includes a mix of different types of buildings, it might be the case that there's an agreement at the beginning that those larger buildings would go through site plan reviews or P&Z council. So sometimes if it's all single family, that doesn't occur. But if it's, multifamily buildings or something close to another zone, that's all worked out with that developmental procedures agreement.
But, so when you're talking about materials and stuff, that's what you're referring to, maybe a commercial building or apartment building or something like that.
The zoning district has those criteria for architectural review.
Okay.
So like Highway 1, for example, has a list of things that is reviewed under. So we're not reviewing things that aren't already required in the code. So if it has review criteria in the code for those things, then you're required to submit them for site plan review. If not, then.
So the land use permit is what we've been doing. That really not changed, right?
The land use permit is just for the small things.
Thank you.
Any other questions for clarity? Okay, then we'll open it up to discussion. Does anyone have any experience with this? Anything they want to share? Any ideas or? You just love this process and think it's perfect and no comments. We'll take it. All right.
I would say that one of the issues I run into a lot is the one size fits all, for like commercial tech review. I mean, what I ran into recently was we have a client that wants to add some parking stalls. They have a parking issue. We've gone through everything. They're meeting setbacks, they're meeting everything else. And then I tell them it's 2 months plus to get reviewed. And of course, you know, by this point, it's August, September, and now they're looking at probably construction in the next year. Hypothetical situation I'm referring to recently was taken care of. But it's something super simple like that, to go through the whole checklist process when 95% of the checklist items don't apply. I mean, an engineer and a planner could probably look at this in a couple hours and say yay or nay. And then it gets, they immediately just get kicked into tech review, no matter how small it is, if it's in one of those zones. So it's almost like, without there being a whole bunch of discussion back and forth, you know, a small parking lot, just because it's in those zones, if there was a process where we could look at it and say, hey, this is really small. We need to take a look at this in a week, 2 weeks, but not, 2 months to go through, wait for tech review and all that, because it's small enough. That would help a lot of these small projects. And, I mean, just because you're in that district, adding 6, 8 parking stalls when you're meeting all the other criteria, to wait that long, and I'm just speaking, like from our client's point of view, they're going, it took you a week to design it, and it's gonna take 2 months to go through the approval process.
Right.
Just one thing I run into kind of often.
Any feedback?
I would say we're equally frustrated with some of the zones that require like, if you're in the College Hill overlay, almost every project has to go, no matter how small, has to go through P and Z council. So that's what we're working on with this code update, is to try to put more objective standards in the code. So not everything has to go through P and Z and council, because that adds 2 to 3 months to the whole process. And also, we understand that some of the small projects with the checklist, we often tell people just fill it out and only check the things that are applicable to your project. But that's a good point with these smaller projects, like at what point do they become enough of a project that it triggers stormwater, or, we have to have a fire division,
Yeah.
It depends on kind of what you're taking looked at, and whether it needs to go through tech review. So that is kind of this gray area there that we try to work with people on some of those things.
Are there other examples, like outside of parking? Like, are there small things that you've seen, projects that you've seen that you think would also fall into that category?
Well, I guess a lot of the time in line for us is whether additional stormwater retention work is required or not. Sometimes the basin's already sized for expansion. But you still have to go through all of the design, the paperwork and everything. And I'll be honest, a lot of times, sometimes paperwork end of this takes just as much time as it takes us to draw up a plan for them. And I don't have a solution for this, but the timelines you go through 10 factor review, like Chris said, there's always going to be comments. So then you wait for the next one for 2 weeks, even if the comments are, walk that kind of tree, or we move some trees around it. And that's just an example. And that's not always the case. It's a case by case thing, but it just seems like it's really one size fits all.
Mhm.
I'll talk about the landscaping several.
If I can pipe in, just real quick, we as staff, we do try, when it's cases like that, we try to not make the timeline as long as it typically would need to be otherwise. If we can get it, into a technical review committee discussion, just, we do tack on usually discussion items at the end of tech review for what we would think are minor things, but we still have everyone in the room. We want to make sure we get everyone sounding off on that. If we can have those discussion items. You know, if it's minor enough, it typically doesn't go to a second tech review or that kind of thing. You know, but if there are comments to address in those, you know, those situations, it, you know,
Has to.
yeah,
Yeah.
it just, it has to.
Chris, can you give some examples of what minor enough might mean? It might be, you know, I'm gonna make it up, 10 trees are missing. Just adding those in and then, you know, approve, if that's not another tech review, for example.
Right.
What are some minor things that we've seen that we haven't required a second tech review meeting?
Yeah, most of it actually is parking related,
Okay.
parking or landscaping related. You know, or if it's like, say it's a detached accessory structure that accompanies a, you know, a commercial development. You know, especially where there's not really a lot of relational considerations with other buildings or that kind of thing. It's just, you know, just a fairly simple project. But typically, if it's something, if it rises to the level of maybe a building addition on a commercial, that kind of thing, that almost always goes through the process, so.
And I would add that if they're really objective, if our comments are very objective, like you need to add 10 trees or, you know, put dimensions on your parking, you know, we can check those things off when we get the site plan back in. So unless there's some judgment call that's still needed by the whole tech review committee, we can just check those things and say, yes, you've met it, you know, you've addressed all of our comments, you can go forward to the next step. So we try not to make people go through tech review twice if there's not something for the group to discuss.
Yeah, I mean, practice that I will do often is if I get something back and everything looks like it's been addressed, I'll follow up with, you know, the person at CFU or, you know, with engineering and make sure that meets what their expectations were as per the tech review discussion. And then, you know, if I have the proper communications happening, then we don't have to go through a second tech review. If it's complicated enough and enough changes on the site plan, then yes, a second tech review discussion certainly has to happen.
So what issues or challenges do you face when you have a more complicated site plan? Obviously, there's a ton of information in these, so.
One question, because I talked to Stephanie yesterday about the internal reviews. I didn't know whether they were informal or actual tech reviews. And so I'm wondering, if you say the site plan has to be all complete by the time you go to the first meeting, I'm not sure if that's what you meant or if that's the informal discussion so that you can finish up or get your questions answered in a tech review, or is that after that's after you've completed everything on your site plan?
You're saying for a pre-application meeting?
Yeah, well, you got to do the pre-app meeting, and then there's a couple opportunities, at least as I understood it, where you can come in and discuss your site plan the way it is and make changes and come back. So I didn't know if you're talking about a full tech review at the first meeting or just something that's going.
I'll add to it. What I said to Craig was sometimes on a more complex one, for example, we'll offer to meet with the applicant after we've given the comments because maybe some discussion is helpful.
Yes, and often it's really just a matter of perspective. There are some perspectives that were in the room at tech review that we'll probably need to call those voices into the room with an applicant and so each can discuss kind of what are the core issues with that site plan. But yes, that's more of an informal meeting that we would have with the applicant, usually in between tech review meetings. We'll say it, tech review comments. You know, we'd really like to meet with you and make sure that our, you know, our comments are understood and just try to make this as seamless as possible for you as the applicant.
So then, back to my question, are there challenges when you do have these more complicated site plans that you see a potential solution to? Or is it just the fact that they are complicated and that's just it?
Landscaping plans. This hangs projects all the time. They're required to be submitted at the time this goes in, and it can get kicked back, say this, it's not complete. A lot of cities have gone to doing the landscaping plan as kind of a separate thing. Because what happens is you submit a site plan. And then through the review process, and especially on bigger, more complicated or weird situations, we change the whole site. Well, that changes the whole landscaping plan. And civil engineer has to submit a landscaping plan as part of the site plan, and often I end up doing it. I know what trees burn well. I don't know a heck of a lot more about landscaping. So having me do the site for the landscaping plan is kind of, I'm eating the points. And I'm pulling from other projects or what I've seen to put this landscaping plan together. I don't know the names of these trees and bushes or what size they get or what they look like. A lot of times in these projects, after we have a site plan, we'll send that to Bias, Lots and Pines, and they'll put together the landscaping plan. And it doesn't match anything that I put in there. Because they're going, that tree doesn't grow there. These bushes aren't even allowed in. This one will kill bunnies. So to do this, in a lot of cities, like I said, on this, we kind of do that separately. We get the site plan, obviously green space requirements, that kind of thing. Yes, you have to take that into account. Otherwise your site plan is not gonna work. But as far as, what diameter the trees are gonna be to submit that right up front, it's just, it seems like an exercise in futility, to do all that at once and have it maybe kicked back because of this landscaping plan. Or it gets kicked back, redo the landscaping plan, and then it goes through the review, and we end up changing a whole bunch of the site, and now that landscaping plan is out the window. But I don't know if there's a different way we can approach those.
So if we decouple the landscaping requirements from the construction.
I think that might be a good way to go about it, and did a project recently in Cedar Rapids, and even Waterloo's kind of gone to, we're doing those separately. Now, they're not gonna give you the okay to go put up your huge building until they have an idea of what your landscaping plan is gonna be, but it's separate from this whole process, and it takes some of the complication out of it. When I'm putting together set plans, my least favorite thing to do is before I send it out, try to throw together a landscaping plan and Google tree types. And that better ends up what it ends up as anyway, because somebody that knows what they're talking about, comes in after the site plan is okay and puts together a real nice and good site.
Yeah, nothing against you guys, I don't think you guys really decide probably what the owner really wants, it's not something that creates enough points that you guys can approve it, and then we're less scrambling trying to figure it out.
Yeah.
You do a great job.
Yeah.
You're nice. But that is a challenge, it doesn't get the owner what they ended up wanting oftentimes either, or don't have as much real opportunity to have it. Whereas landscaping architect or Matthias or somebody can do that much better.
Yeah. Okay, something to take into consideration.
And it is a pretty technical, I'm not sure the language you used before, but it is a pretty, because it's so point based. Like it doesn't require a lot of review on, like, that's probably mostly staff just saying yes or no, right? Like, you're not gonna extend the timeline by weeks and weeks, so you don't get a bunch of, it's not subjective, it's very objective, right? The landscaping part of it.
It's quite objective. And the only caveat I would say is it is important for other departments besides planning to look at the landscape plan, just depending on the location of utilities, for instance, or how that landscape plan might affect something engineering related. It's just good to get all the eyes on it. And then I guess it's just a question of when do we get those eyes on it? If it's not in the initial, these tech review phases that we're talking about, that's something we have to consider.
Do they have a lot of, do they typically have a lot of, issues with the landscaping plans that are presented?
It's usually a comment or two of departments. So it might be a matter of changing the position of, like a tree or two, or
They move a tree 5 feet one way or another because of, something's running through that area. Okay.
In other jurisdictions, when do they require that site plan then? If it's not with, or not site plan, but the landscaping plan, is it before the building permit's issued so they can review it before that, or?
Yeah, and it's typically once we have a site layout and grading. I've had this happen a couple of times where, somebody that wants something that looks really nice, they bring in somebody to put together a landscape, they have the guys put together this landscaping plan. Well, of course, we have to do that up front, and then things change, and then obviously now they're getting charged again to have that landscaping plan redone to match what ends up getting approved. And we've had that recently, and I mean, projects that Gabe and I have worked on, we went through the whole process. I did the landscaping plan. Well, my client wanted something that looked way nicer than what I put in. And they basically had to go back to the drawing board, but were handcuffed by the building I had gotten approved to match that, so we didn't have to go back through the process again.
So I think probably the biggest complication is if it was a site plan that had to be approved by council, then you're kind of stuck with the site plan that.
Yeah.
So if it's administratively reviewed, it's fairly easy for us to say, yeah, that still meets the requirements and yeah, change it out, looks good. But, it's complicated when we've got something the council said is good. Then do we have to take it back through council or, so we're hopefully, I think we could think about this process a little bit,
Yeah.
think about the landscaping, but we could also, I think that's something we would like to work towards, getting more of these site plans approved administratively with objective standards,
Yeah.
rather than have everything go through P and Z council.
We're trying to decrease the yellow with the green.
Yeah.
Yeah, we'd be happy to not look at your trees.
But we could certainly look at something.
and
I
to your
guess making
point,
it more fluid, sorry, Chris, make it a little more like a fluid process, whereas it's not just checklist, check, every box check that applies. This all needs to be by 4 o'clock on Friday, or you're pushed out another 2 weeks. I get given, your main things and then that you need to see. There's a lot of different perspectives on it because somebody tries to come in and doesn't understand the process. It becomes, you gotta have all this in a photometric plan, for instance. It's the same as landscaping. Typically, I don't want to put a photometric plan together until we know what our site's gonna look like, because we might do it twice, which I think we did on Main Street. They kept keep editing as we move things around. We kept having to redo the photometric plan as well. And so and I don't have an answer to how this works, and I'm not saying staff doesn't work with us well on changes, but trying to get all our ducks in a row on every detail and then have to go change it all later. It just seems like we do a lot of things twice.
And some of that, like the bidding process for who the electrician is and who the landscaper are, isn't done until the site project, the site plan, like till it's approved. We're not getting whoever, Stickford, Matthias, Bear Creek, whoever involved. We can't really get them involved until we get that bar. So like there's it just doesn't, Flow doesn't quite work on that part. At least on the commercial side of it.
Sure.
Brandon.
I would completely agree with what Gabe said. I think one thing though, like caveat to that is like, if we get a landscape plan done and approved and like, we had to price that landscape plan, but then you come back, like, the owner does not want that. Matthias prices something that's twice as expensive, or well, spec whoever it might be. That's where we kind of get into conflict sometimes, like, well, you said our budget was gonna be 20,000 for landscape, but it's not 40, what, you know? I don't know how that could happen, but I agree with the landscape plan coming separate from site plan. At least the approval process part or timing, so.
I guess I didn't understand why a landscape plan or a water retention plan is that critical on getting a preliminary site approval. You have the strict codes that tell you how much you have to have, so you have to comply. And maybe that's a way to get around not doing the landscape at that point, is that you have to comply, there's no choice.
Yeah, stormwater might be a little different because you have to allocate enough room, and to get to that point, you have to put your design together and have that as part of it. But landscaping is just a percentage typically of green space and all that. So if you make sure you have enough space for it, you can usually make it work. One of the point that other communities have gone to as far as landscaping plans go is totally get trying to make it objective, but these larger sites, and I think Waterloo is now cutting off at 1 acre. They basically made that more subjective because we run into things where on a large site, say in the industrial park, to meet their point system, it was just an enormous amount of trees and bushes that had to be put in. That was, I mean, you know, they agreed it was kind of ridiculous. And so what they've done is they've gone to over an acre where it's more of a, hey, we think you should have about this many trees. And typically I don't like subjective, but in this case, it seems to work because just following that point system makes it, well, a forest. And they realized that once you get to, you know, especially if you're like on a corner lot, you have, the points are based on frontage.
Right.
Well, then you just end up with in the same amount of bushes and trees and stuff like that, especially for an industrial park setting.
Have you noticed that the points are different between cities that you work with? Okay.
So that's something we can talk about with the big code rewrite is how we want it. You know, we talked about just having a separate chapter on landscaping requirements so that, because our challenge too is like, some of these zones were developed later than the earlier zones. So there's all these minor differences between the zoning districts, which I'm sure is frustrating for us, so it must be immensely frustrating for you folks. And so just cleaning all that up, having one landscaping chapter that says what the requirements are, and looking at replacing the point system with something that makes a little bit more sense, like what is it we're trying to screen here? What is, you know, we want street trees, so let's just say what the street tree requirement is. Let's just say what the parking lot standards are, screening requirements are, and, you know, not have all these point systems. So that might make it a little easier for everybody. So that's something we can look at with the code rewrite.
We have people call that just want us to put together the landscaping plan because they can't figure out the point system. Like, I don't have a minor in math, so I can't figure out how to calculate this. It definitely is pretty complicated, and I've seen some cities going away from just the strict point system where you get a half point for this and 3/4, but you can reduce it if you put a tree over here, and
Right.
it does end up in calculus.
Okay, so we've heard trees. What else?
One more question. I don't want to allocate the time, but since we're talking about reducing time in that P and Z portion, and you've been on P and Z, so you know the process. I've noticed that there's a lot of P and Z stuff that goes through that just really is pretty simple. On those types of projects, or like an infill project that they're talking about, is there a way to just run it through the first week and eliminate the second week if it's something simple and there's no objections?
Yeah, and we typically do, actually. So like, the last, actually, I should say the P and Z meeting 2 times ago, I had 3 cases on there. 2 were design reviews in College Hill. 1 was a minor plat to divide a duplex into 2 separate lots. All 3 of those were relatively simple, had 1 meeting and sent it to council. So we do that as much as we possibly can. It's not it's not fully prescribed that we have to do the 2 meetings. The 2 meetings are usually, a nod to the citizenry, you know, so if there are people within the area that may be concerned about a project, want to say their piece, giving those 2 meetings offers that opportunity.
So it's really up to the planning and zoning commission. So we might suggest in our staff report, that we don't see any issues with it. We would, suggest that they make a recommendation at the first meeting. And then if the public shows up, or if the planning and zoning commission still has questions that we need to bring answers back to, that, it's really the purview of the planning and zoning commission to decide. Yeah, we're okay with it, or no, we need some more information.
Anything else? Speak now, and forever hold your peace on site plans.
Especially around that one.
Are there other things we can put off till later, incorporate more into like a building permit timeline, like the landscape plan, to kind of fit more of a critical path for the development or the design of the overall project? So it's like fenestration or a lighting plan or landscape that we could just do once, or kind of keep that more at the end of the process. That might be helpful to a lot of us.
What I would say about that is, in the end, you have to have the review process. So the site plan review is set up for the bigger things, make sure everything complies with all the codes, and you have everybody, you have the whole staff in the room, all the different divisions. Once that has gone through that process, you have our understanding is it's expensive to prepare the construction drawings. So what you really don't want to have happen is we haven't reviewed all those things, and then you go to all the work to prepare construction drawings, and then we're reviewing fenestration, and we're saying you don't have enough windows and all these things, so you have to go back and redo your construction drawings, because our understanding is that's more expensive for you to do than the site plan review, because the site plan review is a little more, we just need building elevations, and then we're calculating the amounts of windows and doors and all that sort of thing, the materials and everything. So at the end, we have to make sure that it meets the codes. So whether it's at the building code stage or the site plan stage, and our understanding is it's better for the developer to do it at the site plan stage, because it saves you money.
It seems like the risk here, like with the landscape plan, if you end up having to do it twice, because we're off the path, it's kind of like, we ended up putting up the drywall before we did the wiring, so now we gotta pull off the drywall and redo the wiring, and some of these things, like, I get it, you wanna, the goal is to do it once, so, I know you need everybody in the room to sort of make these decisions simultaneously, and that makes sense, but kind of figure out a path to like get certain big approvals like stormwater or the site plan or some of the parking, and then move to the next step instead of figuring out like the whole elevation and all the window openings at the same time, and maybe a lighting plan. It's like some of that seems like it can come down the road. It is expensive to do the building permit and engineer that, but at least at that point, you've really got a lot of your path figured out, and the investors or the developer also are fully on board, and more, we're not going back to the beginning.
Yeah, I think, when we look at the list, we can consider what would make sense potentially to, like Karen mentioned, maybe have a change in the code, or, what could make the process so that if there are big changes, that those things can maybe be shifted around. So I think it sounds like we can look at that list.
The phrase in one of the reviews was the type, durability, and quality of materials needs to comply or be similar to what's already in that area. Or what's around that. But that's not always applied in every site plan, it's based on certain.
Yeah, it really depends on, kind of the standards in a particular district or zone. You know, we don't usually have those, for instance, in, let's see. You don't usually see those in our typical districts, R1, R2, R3, C1, C2, C3. But we do have them in downtown. There's quite a few material standards in our downtown code. And those can be reviewed by anyone, by an applicant. And then material standards really in College Hill, and then any of these specialized zones that are listed on under P and Z council review.
So as the review is expanded across the city to other, and the codes are updated to be a little more standardized, would that kind of wording be included in a broader part of the community?
So I think what you're talking about is that language about generally compatible with, we would like to jettison that out of the zoning ordinance altogether, because that is very subjective, right?
Yep.
I mean, how do you, and so those are the kind of reviews that have to go through P and Z and council, because, you know,
It reminds me of an HOA.
right,
It also,
Right.
it also could inhibit new ideas or new types of construction that might be more cost effective or, you know.
So we got-
I was concerned that that could get.
right, we got rid of all that language in the downtown code. If that's what was our goal, was to get rid of like, the height of the building has to be generally compatible with the rest of the buildings downtown. Well, what does that mean, you know? And there was lots of debates. Some people thought it should be taller, some people thought it should be shorter, and so people were having to redesign their buildings 2 and 3 times because nobody could agree. So we got rid of all that language and just said, very numerical, this is what it is, and as far as the material standards, and it's very specified, there's a list of things. And also the other thing we added in downtown code is we added more flexibility. So you can go through a minor adjustment process and we can approve that, you know, every project's a little bit different, and maybe you have a little site constraint or something that we can then just approve administratively, and it doesn't have to go through a big, huge process to do it. So that's the other element with the zoning code update, is building in a little more flexibility into our codes. So there's a little more ability to make changes that make sense, that really don't need to be reviewed very broadly. So.
Yeah, another thing you'll see in the downtown code, you know, we have some residential areas of downtown that are under there that, you know, we have in our downtown code some siting requirements, you know. And so, for instance, the residential use areas of downtown are pretty much allowed any siting that's typically allowed for residential use. So that's something that is typical. Now, there's a little bit higher of a standard for something like our Main Street. You know, we want our Main Street to look quite nice, and so we have a little bit higher standards for those. But all the standards that are in downtown code are objective. Like we can look at the code, look at the project and say, yep, that's great. Like that works.
So just, thank you, just to tag on to that, and that code went through a review by our planning and zoning commission, public input, and then council adopted, giving staff basically the authority. I know that question always comes up about, well, who's approving and under what authority? And so we are trying to streamline that if council agrees, yes, these should be the standards, you know, 75% downtown should be brick, for example, in the storefront area, and it should have, you know, 100% windows, I'm making it up for that storefront or whatever, windows and doors. Then, right, we're gonna say, yep, check, meets the code, and move on. So we're trying to get that, because that also takes out what's come up in other meetings is, well, the public and the not my backyard. And we're trying to take that out of the equation. If the community's decided these are standards that work, you know, the person upset about whatever standard should have been involved in the adoption of that. You know, the park standard, the park dedication will comment at that time about that ratio versus specific developments. and trying to, I don't know, tank the development, that's not fair. That's not, I mean, the standard is the standard. So that's also trying, I know that that's been a common concern about those public comments, and so it helps us that way as well.
Okay, anything else? Okay, well, that will conclude our site plan discussion. I think we have a few slides at the end that Matt is gonna talk about from our last meeting.
Go right on in.
I guess we just have a couple follow-up items from the last meeting. There were a couple questions regarding, the first one was related to fines. More so like what fines have been in place or have been issued over recent. And so we did just some quick searches, both the DNR database and the EPA database had a few different areas throughout in Iowa, just kind of doing a search, and really just the high level of this is we just want to point out that, these fines, they impact not only the development, the contractor, but they can also involve the DNR, the city, and then the EPA, obviously on top of the federal level, but tried to give a couple different examples of how they look both on a subdivision, a site, and a commercial project, and a city project. So kind of that first one there with Iowa DNR, this was the residential subdivision in Norwalk, Iowa. Both the developer and contractor were fined for NPDS violations due to sedimentation and failed site controls, and that was adjacent to a ravine or a creek. A project in West Des Moines, a city and the city's contractor, were working on a bridge, and they were fined $8,000 for a similar situation where they had a failed site control system. A site plan or a site in Swisher, Iowa, was fined $4,500 also for NPDS violations, for washout that ended up in a nearby creek. And then just another one I just want to point out was, the EPA also recently has issued, the city of Ames and their contractor. And there's another firm that was in there as well. The EPA brought in as well, and the three of them were fined $165,000 for, the contractor was refusing to install the SWIP controls. And that prolonged and ended up in a larger situation that the EPA had a violation on. So again, I think the point of this slide isn't a scare tactic, but it's just trying to point out that, the DNR and the EPA, when it comes to these situations, if you're approached by the DNR or the EPA, that is something to take seriously. A lot of the times they are willing to help work with you. They're not gonna just start slapping fines, they're usually trying to provide a solution to move forward. And try and resolve the matter at hand. It's usually when things aren't addressed or they're prolonged and action isn't taken, that's when those fines and situations start to take effect. So, again, it's widespread too, so it can be specific to one entity or it can be everybody, including the city. Another follow-up, infill lots. There's a lot of questions on, the 1 acre requirement. When is it jump from number 2 required or not? And so we took some of the language out of what is in the Iowa DNR jump from number 2 language. And it does focus on that, specifically that 1 acre requirement. Now, within that, the site, if it's a part of a larger planned development, like a subdivision that's active, that would still require the use of a GP2, not independently having to be brought in for an infill lot. But you're still under a general permit number 2, so it's always good to be aware of if you're in a subdivision, you know, the timeline of, it was brought up in the meeting of 7 years, that's kind of a vague term, it kind of depends on how the site's progressing. For example, maybe a larger development, they may keep expanding the general permit number 2 as they continue to develop it through different phases. So that's just something to be working, if you're a site contractor, working with the developer on, the subdivision developer on, but generally it's the 1 lot trigger or the 1 acre trigger for when you need a GP2. If you're outside of a larger development, the DNR is looking at, are you disturbing more than an acre? So maybe you might only be on a lot that's less than an acre, that you're working on, but if you're disturbing more than an acre, that's when you may be required to have a general permit number 2. So if you're using an adjacent vacant lot, but you're disturbing that, like you're using that as your laydown yard, you're using that, you're likely gonna need general permit number 2 for that as well, if the total disturbed area is over an acre.
Can I ask a question on that? So, you know, we see, I have a 60-acre preliminary plat, and I'm going to final plat, you know, I'm gonna have 5 different final plats as I go through. And so I'm gonna get a GP on just the final plat where I'm working. Is it better to close that out before you go on to the next final plat? Or is it better to expand that GP into the 2 final plats? I guess, do you have a recommendation on that, or what do you see most often, and does it work?
Yeah, it ranges wildly depending on how quick your development's progressing. So if you're turning year over year into a new phase, generally you're expanding your scope of your general permit number 2 because you're having houses being built in your prior phase while you're still working ahead. With that said, the DNR does allow you to redraw your general permit number 2 boundary. So that's something you can be doing as you work out, is slowly changing the boundary of your scope of your general permit number 2. Now, if you're in an area where maybe you're doing a phase of a subdivision, and maybe you're gonna do your next phase in 5 years, and you were able to achieve your establishment, and you're able to close that out with your engineer, then you'd close and establish a new general permit number 2. Another question was, what does the term active mean? And there's some terms of what's active in terms of like a house lot versus a subdivision and a city lot. In general, it's defined as, you know, a site is considered active once any of the soil disturbance begins. And it's considered active until it's finally stabilized. Kind of on individual lots, we'll look at a disturbance is usually if it's disturbed within the lot, you know, it's active, like once you've started your grading operations, you're placing your foundation, it's usually considered that's active until you reach your point of vegetation, and you're pouring your driveway and pavement's going down. On a subdivision, you know, you're active during your mass grading, your utilities. You know, like we were just saying, you can phase. Your areas can be phased separately depending on, you know, where you're working in terms of if you have a stockpile area, maybe somewhere else or not, but you need to go back and stabilize each phase. So if you have a stockpile, maybe somewhere over there, you need to go back. And if that gets stabilized, you know, that's considered non-active anymore, but if you're still working over in part A, you know, you still need to keep working and trying to get your stabilization there. On city projects, once we start the earthwork, you know, a lot of times on the public works projects, you know, we're actively mid-block, we're taking out the public road. We've started, once the road comes out, if the utilities are out, and then we're the same case, we're considered active until all those disturbed areas are restored. Another thing we want to talk about, just, we had some internal meetings and just kind of discussed, you know, some implementation that we can start moving forward on and talking with staff, and so, quarterly SWIP site inspections. If the representative is willing and wants to, we'll schedule those with that representative, just to do the on-site with them. So we'll start getting that process going. We'll kind of work to make sure we have the right representative per site if you have multiple sites. But when those quarterlies come around, we'll work to get those scheduled with you and try and find a time that works for everybody. Weekly inspection reports. We can, if you give us access, we're more than willing to work with you on your Google Drive, OneDrive, Dropbox system. If you would like the city to, we can open up a SharePoint folder where you can drop those files into. It's kind of preference, but we can be digital in this system, so whether we want to use your system or we can help facilitate that as well. Just coordinate that with us and we can help make that happen. Correction timeline, looking to help implement this a little bit better. So, if it's a non-urgent request, there's not immediate threat. On a Monday through Wednesday, if we notice it, trying to get that fixed by Friday. It's kind of a Thursday through Friday when we notice it, trying to get fixed by Tuesday. If it's urgent, Monday through Thursday, I'm trying to have that corrected in 24 hours. Or by the end of the day, Friday. And then if it's something that's on Friday, we're gonna try and say, hey, try and get that addressed as much as possible, trying to limit that exposure. By end of day Monday at the latest to get that resolved. So just trying to help facilitate, if you're getting inspected on Friday, kind of when, you can expect maybe those corrections to be made. And obviously it's gonna be dependent upon what it is and what time of year it is and what's happening. So, that's just kind of a general timeline we're gonna work to implement, so. That is.
When can we start using like electronic submittals for SWIP inspection reports?
Anytime. Maria said she actually is already, so.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Do we still need to do a whole SWIP mailbox and everything if we do go that route?
No, you can have a digital one, it just has to be accessible and available on all the numbers. Yeah, so if you have a Google Drive you're working on, or you have some sort of platform, just give us access to it. We do that way. We can generate
One question,
Yeah,
going back to the residential, you had explained what term act is. And I personally like some clarification on what that means. It sounded like we're talking about from the time that the project starts until landscaping is complete is considered active. But oftentimes, if we have a 14-day period where somebody determines that maybe the site is not being worked, how do you consider that? If that's an active site, then that shouldn't be part of inspection.
so in terms of the SWIP permit, we're talking about once the soil is disturbed, once the soil finally gets stabilized, saying that the site is active. Now, you can have interim controls in place such as hydromulching or stabilizing, those stabilize the site. But until your final stabilization is placed, your site is still considered active according to the DNR. So you're active until, your sod or final seed comes in.
So,
On site.
In the middle of a project and, now you're working on the inside, you can't work on the outside. And so a 14-day period passes, there's still required that we temporary mulch everything. Is that still there?
So you have to show that you have the site stabilized during that period and you're still doing weekly inspections.
And that's the soot controls, correct?
Well, you have your erosion controls and your sedimentation controls, so you have your perimeter controls and then you have if you're not actively working physically on the site or material, you'd be having it stabilized. Usually, that's where the cover comes into play, so you're hydromulching or you're doing some sort of temp seeding.
Can we eliminate that expense?
If you can convince the DNR and the EPA, yes.
Well, I got my feet down, so. They're not hard to work with.
I think what Craig's saying too is there's two different versions of active site. So you're saying it's an active site from when it starts until landscaping's finished, but there's also the dirt being active or not for 14 days, what we talked about. So if dirt hasn't moved in 14 days, it's gotta be.
Then you have to, it has to be stabilized, yeah.
They just actually run the skin.
Bingo.
Well, that's what it is, it's game. I didn't, well, this is just my personal viewpoint, once I talked to, this one of the things just irritates the crap out of builders. Because we're still working the project. And if somebody goes and determines, well, your skid loader was parked there and it hasn't moved for 14 days, well, you don't know that. We're grading the backyard. And immediately, you gotta stabilize this, well, we're working, still working the project. And I think that's some of the issues that have become very, very difficult for a lot of us in enforcement. We don't mind stabilizing the site as far as our erosion controls and maintaining those, but to have to stop 2 or 3 times in the project to spray hydroseed and mulch and all the other good stuff is kind of just a wasted expense.
And to that, I would say, unfortunately, there have been bad actors and others, I'm not saying in this community, but, that have resulted in, I'll give an example in this community. When I first started, we had a situation where somebody was contesting that they had their site controls, but they refused to do the stabilization on the soil. They're doing the lift. They kept refusing to. He stated, well, I have my controls in place. I don't need anything else. You're wasting time and money. And it ended up resulting in causing a mud landslide that involved our trail and the 2-lane, 4-lane roadway that actually involved significant amount of damage to our storm sewer system, caused the roadway to be closed. So there was an actual tangible issue that could have been solved from a rain event, but
Is that more of an issue that the original SWIFT controls put in probably more adequate for the site?
well, it was kind of an issue of the site controls were placed, but they had about 3 or 4 different seating windows they chose not to take action in, and no action was taken for other work in that time. So,
Just something to consider.
I agree, it's just unfortunately, yeah, just, there's other bad actors and we're just trying to adhere to the rules, and unfortunately, in certain situations, it can be a runaway event where it can be a situation that does actually cause an issue.
Have we had those experiences in Cedar Falls?
Yes, yeah,
We have.
we have, yeah. We had the fish kill 97, was related to construction activity, erosion. Was documented, and then we've had some other issues.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep,
All right, that concludes our meeting. We'll be back on December 18th to talk about building permits and final inspections. So we hope you all can join us, and make sure to tell your friends that aren't here this time that we've got an exciting one coming up. Jamie. Okay, all right, the meeting is adjourned.